Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Black Studies Podcast. Today, we have the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Tara T. Green, the class distinguished professor and chair of African American Studies at the University of Houston. She also has a joint appointment in the English department. Dr. Green is a literary and interdisciplinary studies scholar with a doctorate in English. She is the award-winning author and editor of 6 books, including Love, Activism, and the Respectable Life of Alice Dunbar-Nelson, and See Me Naked, Black Women Defining Pleasure During the Interwar Era, as well as the co-curator of the Triad Black Lives Matter collection housed at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. Black feminism and her Southern familial experiences with storytelling influences her approach to her research areas, which include African American fiction and autobiography, African literature, Black leadership and activism, Black Southern studies, and the Harlem Renaissance. She is from the suburbs of New Orleans, which immensely impacts her work. Hello, how are you doing today, Dr. Green?
Hi, I'm doing well.
Well, thank you so much for being here. I'm excited to talk to you about Black studies and about your research. So let's start with how you got into Black studies as a field and what keeps you committed to doing the work of Black studies.
Well, I guess I've always been in Black studies, maybe not formally, but personally, because of my family and growing up. My uncle on my mother's side and my mother would often tell about the experiences of growing up in the Jim Crow South in North Louisiana, where that side of my family is from. My dad's side grew up in rural Mississippi as well, but there was a kind of silence around the experiences that they had. And so it was either the silence or the telling of the stories that led me to want to sort of bridge the gap and to make sure that certain stories are told and to understand what those silences are about. So going to Dillard University and HBCU, where you're entrenched in Black studies thought, was certainly a beginning for me. And then from there, I knew really at Dillard University that I would want to become a professor and a researcher and walk on this path that I continue on today.
Thank you. So your research areas encompass, I mean, they're solidly in Black studies, but they encompass a lot of intersecting layers of Black studies thought and in the tradition. Do you want to speak a little bit about some of the research you've done for your books?
Yeah, well, everything that I write comes from two perspectives. One, growing up as a Southern girl of two parents, even though sometimes my family reminds me, they tell me I'm from Chicago, whatever that means, because my parents got married and in 1969 they moved to Waukegan, Illinois, where I was born, and I lived there for the first 7 years of my life. But we always returned to the South, and everybody around us was from the South. So people in the Midwest know that story. But I did grow up in the suburbs of New Orleans. And so having the influences of New Orleans, which has its own unique culture, as well as having a Southern perspective that is wider, and the food that we ate and the sounds that I heard, and again the stories of parents who were from rural areas, who had to work in fields. All of those things converge. But then at some point I realized that I was a Black feminist, and those ideals of equality that are part of the Black feminist tradition were always around me, even with Black women who were very strong. Stories about them and the work that they did to develop institutions, important ones in communities like churches. If it had not been for those Black women and their ingenuity and their work to make sure that those institutions were funded, then they would not still exist today. So they didn't call themselves Black feminists, but in my reading of them and listening to those stories, that's exactly who they were. So all of that is shown in my work. More recently, I have published 2 books, one on Alice Dunbar-Nelson, who is from New Orleans. She was born there in 1875. Again, they did not use the language of Black feminism, but she certainly was, because she was a part of the Black club women's movement, and she would be married 3 times. But also in her life, she was an English teacher. That's familiar to me. Of course, she was born in New Orleans, as I've stated, but she also went to what is now today Dillard University. So she was very active in the communities in which she lived, from New Orleans to Wilmington, Delaware, to Philadelphia, where she died in 1935. So learning about what it meant to be a feminist at that time, learning about the love that she had for her community along with other Black women, that work is just extremely important. There are so many stories that we can learn from those women who work together, again, raising funds to make sure that there were health clinics and schools and other kinds of very important institutions that bring us to where we are today, with our universities and hospitals, and people with degrees as MDs and nurses and so on.
Thank you. So, with the work that you've done and uh, the influence of Black feminism on your work, having your PhD in English, working in African American Studies, chairing an African American Studies department, how do you situate yourself disciplinarily in terms of where you see yourself as a scholar?
And I'm often asked that. So I am disciplinarily I am trained as a literary scholar. So the close reading, looking at details and pulling a story out of those details, that becomes really important when working in an archive. And so even though I was not necessarily trained like historians to go in and look at archives and to pull stories from those, I did do that when I was writing my dissertation. My dissertation was on Richard Wright and his treatment of women in his literature. So I still do that. It's the archive may not be written documents. Sometimes it may be music or film, but I look at those as archival um, materials, if you will. So the disciplinary then works into the kind of interdisciplinary work, because I think as people, we don't tell a story without several things for us sort of converging to help us to tell that story. And so, I mean, for example, right now we are using technology to tell stories in some ways about how we get into these certain fields. And for me, then that's the interdisciplinary work that is being practiced. And so capturing those practices becomes important to me as a writer when I am pulling from my own different experiences, either personally or the kind of academic training that I have, to produce something for people to be able to learn more about particular individuals.
Thank you. How would you say your practice as a teacher is informed by Black studies and the broader work that you do in terms of telling the stories of people, particularly Black women like Alice Dunbar Nelson, um, and conveying that information to students?
Yeah, so students have to learn, first of all, that we told stories in a variety of ways very early on before we get to the written work. And so usually I do work from historical periods to present to future. Sometimes I try to combine some things earlier on in a course. So it may be that a student is reading um, a sci-fi work that's placed in a far future or a different world, along with something historical about slavery, for example, because if one of the ways that I try to help students to understand a story of, let's say, Olato Equiano, when he walks on that ship and he sees these white male figures for the first time, and he describes that. What's the difference between that experience, especially as we read it, and the experience of somebody getting on a spaceship and going into outer space? For him, in some ways, it probably was the same in the way in which he describes it. He's never seen white people before. Why are their faces red? Are they going to eat me? All of the kinds of questions that he poses in that particular chapter of his engagement with his white captors at that time are the same kinds of experiences that we have as writers as readers of Afrofuturistic text. And so for students to be able to have an experience as a reader, but also as a listener of a story. So whether it is told to them orally, and oftentimes we get into that. I may have someone come to a class who has had a certain experience in the community who can share that experience orally. Or it may be that written experience. They may be watching a documentary. So I try to use as much as I can in the classroom for students to have a diverse learning experience, because again, that's the interdisciplinarity that we experience, I think, on a daily basis. But it is also how we learn, how we engage, how we experience. They can have that in the classroom as well.
Thank you. I think that that's so it's important, and it's not necessarily said out loud as much as it probably should be. Like, we're doing these things on a daily basis. So
Mhm.
these are things that can also be translated into the classroom. Like, you don't have to look at the classroom as a space where it's completely different than the learning that you do walking down the street, meeting new people. I think that that makes the research and the work itself more accessible. So that framing, I'm sure, is super helpful for students. In that, so building on that, right? If we think about a Black Studies department, what about how do we cultivate a department space that facilitates that for students beyond the classroom, but, like, within the university? Does that make sense?
Yeah, well, one of the things that I love, I tell people all the time that my preference in academia, if I am to survive in academia and to flourish in academia, then being in the English department doesn't work well for me. I did that my first 3 years of being in academia. I was at Southern University, so that was really a kind of different experience. But when I transitioned from being at an HBCU to being at a predominantly white institution when I went to Northern Arizona, I would not have been able to survive and to have gotten tenure if it had not been for ethnic studies. The problem for me is that I was the only African Americanist on that campus, and if people look at my CV, and if you understand anything about me, being near water um, is something that I have to have. I feel like it's an ancestral experience for us as well. If we go and look at certain African traditions, but also I'm from the a Gulf Coast state, and so we fear water, but we also want it to be near us in sort of controlled ways. We have a love-hate relationship with water. So then that brings me to an Atlantic state of North Carolina, where I was 100% in African American studies. And now I am pretty much in African American studies, but I still have that connection to an English department because I love to teach literature and I want to be able to expose other students to literature. So for me, being in academia and being successful in it is being around colleagues who know all of these different and wonderful things that I don't know. And that becomes a community, because in any community, it thrives if you don't have everybody who's thinking the same way. right? If you have the person that may be so annoying that they're always asking a question every time somebody says something, but that's just the way that they think. Um, you have to have somebody in who creates in this way. You have to have somebody in who creates in a very different way, because when those people are able to come together, then those conversations are enriching the experiences that students have, prepares them in ways that just one of us could not imagine, because we're all working together for the same goal. So, what I love about being chair of African American Studies is being able to have the door thrown wide open and having a community where we can invite people to the table. I tell students all the time, stop talking about having a seat at somebody else's table. The skills and tools that we are giving you are for you to be able to create your own table and extend invitations. And so that's what we are able to do in a Black Studies community.
I really like that. Thank you. Creating your own table and then extending the invitations.
Yes.
That's, I think, a really useful framing, particularly right now. Um, with so many things going on, it can be easy to overlook the fact that, yeah, you have a table or you can create a table. You don't have to worry about invitations to other people's.
Mhm.
Figure out what your table looks like and who you want to be in community with. That's a really helpful framing. Thank you.
Mhm.
So building on that, although I'm sure some of it you have touched on already, particularly because of your work on um, Alice Dunbar-Nelson, but what interests you most about the past of Black studies? And that can be in both, like, excited senses, but also maybe critical senses.
Mhm. What interests me most is what I don't know. That's why I got into this in the first place, again, because I was very curious about the silences. How could I go to school? I went to predominantly white schools for a variety of reasons. How could I get through a Louisiana history course, and if one Black person was named in that Louisiana history course, and this was in the 8th grade, so I still remember this. If a Black person was actually named in that course, and I do mean named, there may have been, yeah, well, there was slavery at this time, and then maybe they moved on. But if one person was named, I am not aware of it. How could I go to school right outside of New Orleans and not hear the name Alice Dunbar Nelson until I was a student at Dillard University? So it's that sort of curiosity that that drives me in this field, because I will never know everything. That's why I try to surround myself with people who know different kinds of things, and we have, symposiums and invite speakers, and we go to places to find out more and more and more. We're lifelong learners, and we have to be in African American studies. I don't know anybody who's in Black studies, who's truly in Black studies, who does not, who is not constantly trying to learn something new.
Yeah.
It doesn't even matter how old they are. Sometimes we have people who are just taking classes, who just want to sit in, who are auditing our courses, and they have been retired. Like, they might be in their 70s. They still want to know more because they're curious, because they weren't able to get some of this information 40 years ago or 50 years ago. It just wasn't available to them. So I imagine that that will be the person that, I will be the same when I'm 70 or 80, if I make it that long, or 90 or whatever, that I'll always be driven by the curiosity that allows me to say, sometimes in the middle of the night, that's how I got to Alice Dunbar Nelson. I had a question. Why did she leave New Orleans? That was my research question. to marry Paul Laurence Dunbar, and that became a book. The book that I wrote that's sort of a sequel to that one, See Me Naked, which is that phrasing comes out of her diary. She talks about going swimming and taking off her clothes where no one could see her naked. The curiosity that I had around what did women learn that that gave them joy in their lives. That's why that book is about pleasure. It's really defining pleasure, but looking to these Black women who are gone now, but what did they leave for us? What lessons what did they learn, and what can we learn from these women of that particular time period? It's the interwar era. Women like Lena Horne and Minnie Memphis, who was this musician that I didn't know anything about. I had to sort of track her down because I wanted to write about a blues woman. So what could we learn about those women that they found joy in their life despite the fact that they were alive during a particular period of time where there was a lot of sadness and tragedy in the world. And guess what? As Black women, we are really dealing with that kind of experience now if we pay more attention to one space instead of ourselves and to other spaces. So these women left us some kernels of truth that we might want to really consider in bad times.
Thank you. I have been doing a lot of reading from women or in about women, Black women from the past as well. Because as you said, there's things that we can learn from them to make it through where we are right now. And there are strategies and yeah, it's there's so much that can be gained,
Mhm.
and it's really been a helpful experience to be able to do that, to be able to see, okay, well, they did this, or this was something that was common then. This is something that was cultivated. This was an institution or a community organization that was built. This is how they engaged in community care. This is how they engaged in self care
Mhm.
in a situation where, while contextually the larger social context may have parallels, right? There's different levels of resources, there's different realities, there's different access to things. So we can learn from them and take those strategies and put them within the context that we're operating now, with sometimes the accessibility of things, I think is
Mhm.
key, right? Like I I've had many times the conversation about like people who got their PhDs before the internet became a thing, and like having to go to specific libraries and just live there while you're trying to do this work. Like
Mhm.
that was not my reality.
Mhm.
Uh, but it happened.
Mhm.
Like, people did it, they made it work. So given the accessibility of this information, we can definitely tap into it in a way that is easier than it would have been when they were living through things and creating the strategies. So,
Mhm. Mhm.
yeah. So what interests and excites you about the present and the future? And, like, where do you think, particularly given our current context, what should Black studies be doing or asking as we move forward?
Yeah, so what excites me about the present and the future is always our students. So I think about one student in particular, and there are many, but I'll just give this example because I just saw a posting of hers on LinkedIn. She's a student who discovered that she wanted to be, and she came from Minnesota to be an African American Studies major with us at the University of Houston. And she discovered in my class actually that she wanted to do some sort of career in being a librarian. And it was because we were looking at archives. A student had set up an exhibit. That exhibit had been something that told the story of how our now department began. And that student was inspired by that. And by the time she graduated a couple years later, she had gotten into the library science program at the University of Alabama. And she posted that she had done a community preservation workshop in her hometown of Minneapolis. Now, this is the future. So, this is happening in the present. She's preparing for the future. If we consider that within the last 24 to 48 hours, the headlines, the Smithsonian needs to be aligned with a certain way of thinking. Well, that's probably not going to always be the case, but somebody will have to be ready to be able to realign and to make sure that those libraries, those museums are telling the American history that is inclusive of all of us who are Americans and have been Americans for generations. So we are then we provide a pipeline for students to become those individuals who will be doing that work. They will be the griots of the future. That's what they're preparing us to do. So again, that's how that past connects, because we've always done that. That's why I am here doing what I do, because somebody told me a story, and folks who didn't even have a high school diploma, they didn't know what I was going to do with that story. But right now, I'm still collecting, I'm still writing, I'm still doing the work. So, that's what I expect to see is the work that we're doing in the present is going to pay off in the future. We have students that are preparing to go to law school. And the one thing that I've heard many, many times is that they need the lawyers because the lawyers are the ones that are going to save us. They're the ones putting up the blocks. They are the ones who are going in and making the arguments so that we can still have a democracy in this country. That's what a community looks like of Black studies, is that we have people in so many different diverse areas who are working together to not just preserve, but really to ensure and to protect. So those are the kinds of things. What was your last question? So I want to make sure that I get it about the
So,
question that.
yeah, where should we be going? Like, what
Mhm.
questions maybe Black studies should be asking as we
Yeah.
move forward from this moment?
Yeah, so how can we do more of that and be successful in doing it? That's the question that that we should be asking. How do we continue to prepare our students for what is now, and the impact that impact will not be one that is lasting in such a way that those stories are not told, that we do not have a democracy, that we do not have X, Y, and Z. So, when I think about the work that I plan to do in my Introduction to African American Studies course right now, which will be that they'll be preparing how to do, learning how to do oral interviews for a particular kind of project that's about Black people here in Texas. And they will be learning how to use AI responsibly. So, because our students have to know how to use technology in a way that can come up with those questions, evaluate whether those are the right kinds of questions to ask,
Mhm.
and evaluate whether responses that are being put out from AI or the kinds of responses that will help to develop communities and not harm them in the future. So that is the kind of work that we have to do in Black studies. If we don't do it, I don't know who will, and I don't want to know. I know that we have to do it. We don't have a choice.
Yeah. Thank you. That's 1, so true. But 2, I think it is such a useful way to think about, like, we are training stewards of silenced information and silenced communities and things that are being erased right now, to hold that until it can be. And even, like, if that doesn't happen, like, in the academy, like, if even if it doesn't officially happen, these stories, these strategies, this information has always been held by somebody.
Mhm.
So, training people to be able to do that regardless of the broader political or social situation is so necessary. Because, like you said, I don't wanna know what it looks like if Black studies isn't doing that work.
Mhm.
Because it's probably not going to be what it should be
Mm.
if Black studies is not doing that work.
Yeah, we have to.
Yeah. So, thank you so, so much. Is there anything you want to add? I know it is the 150th year of the anniversary of the birth of Alice Dunbar-Nelson. Is there anything you want to add about your research on her or any of the other upcoming projects you have?
Yeah, well, I everybody that knows me knows how much I love the story of Alice Dunbar Nelson. She was just a phenomenal woman who got kind of buried behind the name that she kept because she was married to Paul Laurence Dunbar. But the interesting thing is that he was her first of three husbands. And so to know more about how she lived a life despite the kinds of criticisms that she would have received and at times did receive because she married a man who was much younger than she was. And despite the fact that she also had affairs with women that people did not know about unless they were in because they kept very small circles about same-sex relationships during that time. But, which is also something to note about what these women were doing at these Black club women's conventions, by the way, folks. But there we have to look at multiple archives to be able to sort of find out why meetings went a certain way. But the most criticism that she received in her lifetime was because she married this much younger man who would be her second husband that she met at Cornell University. And then she would go on to marry a third man who she was married to for the longest. And he was also an activist. That's how she ends up in Philadelphia. So it's such a wonderful story to know so much about her, not only as a writer and her struggles as a writer. It wasn't an easy life that she had. She had a lot of physical and medical problems. She does die fairly early, but she was a smoker also. But it's a life that is worth knowing something about. There are very few Black women that we have such a full and rich archive about. If we can imagine how much has been thrown away,
Yeah.
so that there are Black women whose names we don't know, but because she had a niece who was a librarian, she understood the importance of keeping those materials and donating those, and they would be housed where they still are at the University of Delaware. So I put it together in a book for everybody to be able to read and enjoy.
Well, thank you. That's definitely, like, these stories are so important, and I think that being able to have stories about the fullness of people's lives, is necessary and not as well known. Like, people did the work, and they fought for rights, and they organized, and they raised money, and they did all of these amazing things, but they were also real people.
Yes.
And to be married 3 times at that particular
Mhm.
time in history,
Mhm.
to, um, have affairs with women, to live a life as a full person, and to understand that these great people that we looked up to were also human beings, and they were full people. I think that that is so necessary in thinking about not just the strategies that they utilized doing the work of social justice, but also like how they survived.
Mm.
Like they were not, that was not the sole thing that was happening in their lives, right? Like there was pleasure regardless of all of the things that were happening. And
Mhm.
they cultivated that for themselves in the ways that they needed to. And that's important to recognize as well. So
Mhm.
thank you very, very much. Thank you for your time and for your work. I'll give you back our rapidly ending summer on a Friday. So thank you so much again.
Thank you. It's been great.